These days, it seems that every conversation about learning and education ends up in a discussion about the role of new AI technologies. Like many people, I'm intrigued with the ways that AI could support children and educators in the learning process. But I'm also concerned about the ways that some AI technologies are entering the lives of children. I worry that AI could end up reducing children's sense of agency, limiting their choices and voices. As I sort out my own thinking on these issues, I'm always interested to talk and share ideas with others who are thinking carefully about the role of AI in education and learning, whether they are AI advocates or AI skeptics or somewhere in between. So for this episode of the podcast, I was happy to get a chance to talk with Sal Khan, the well-known founder of Khan Academy. Though best known for its extensive collection of free video tutorials on a wide variety of topics, Khan Academy has also been a leader in integrating AI into its product offerings, most notably through its Khanmigo AI tutor. Sal wrote enthusiastically about the potential for AI in education in his book titled Brave New Words: How AI Will Revolutionize Education and Why That's a Good Thing. As you'll hear in our conversation, Sal and I are aligned on many issues. For example, we both believe that interacting with human teachers and classmates and friends must continue to play a central and essential role in the learning process, even in the age of AI. At the same time, Sal and I have some differences in our educational priorities and points of emphasis. For example, I believe that the best way for children to learn important skills and ideas is by providing them with opportunities to work on interest-driven, personally meaningful projects, while Sal argues that it's sometimes important to be, in his words, a little more prescriptive to make sure students learn subject matter in the traditional curriculum. As a result, Sal and I have some differences in how we think about AI in education, and I wish we'd been able to probe those differences a little more deeply in our conversation. Still, I feel that the conversation with Sal helped me in my ongoing process of clarifying and sharpening my thinking about AI in education, and I hope that you'll find it helpful too. Hi, Sal. Thanks a lot for joining us on the Lifelong Kindergarten podcast.
Great to be here, Mitch.
Well, our paths have crossed a number of times over the years, reaching all the way back to your undergraduate years here at MIT. And, I think I've always had an appreciation for, your goal at Khan Academy for providing a free platform to expand learning opportunities for people around the world, especially people who haven't had those opportunities.
Yeah, well, it's great to hear that. And yes, we go way back. I mean, I knew you before you knew me. I remember my first, at MIT, they call it UROPS, undergraduate research opportunity. This was summer of 1995. I had a UROP at the Media Lab, and I was working in Rosalind Picard's group, but I was kind of envious of what you were, whenever I walked by, what you were doing with the Legos and the toys and all of that. I was like, that's what I think I would want to work on, but I couldn't figure out how to get in. But no, I've been a big admirer of your work over the years.
I thought I'd start by trying to hear a little about, the broader goals of what you see for the goals of education and learning. As I was reading your book, I did see, one line that jumped out at me is you say, it's more important now than ever that students have strong communication, collaboration, and empathy skills. And in that same section, you also talk about the importance of creativity and creative thinking. And for me, that really resonated because I often say these days that it's more important than ever to help young people develop as creative, curious, collaborative, and caring learners. So actually, I'd be interested in hearing your thoughts about why do you feel those types of skills are so important today?
Yeah, and I tend to be, I call myself a traditionalist plus, because there's the traditional traditionalists who are all about, master the reading, the writing, the mathematics, have strong content knowledge, even memorizing. And then you have, I would call the the traditional progressives who sometimes downplay some of that and they say, no, it's all about collaboration. It's all about exploration. It's all about creativity. And I think, frankly, I think it's always been, you need both. If you don't have some of those core traditional skills, you're not going to be as strong of a tool user. You know, when the calculator came out, people said, oh, you don't have to know arithmetic anymore. I was like, well, kind of, but the people who understood the algorithms and knew how to apply it and who could do mental math, they actually put themselves in positions where they were actually more amplified by the computation. Similarly, when search came out and the internet, people say, oh, no one has to have knowledge anymore. Well, it turns out, one, the people who are even in a position where they could leverage, say, search for their job are the ones, you know, we could debate whether you need these hoops to jump through, but the hoops usually require some knowledge. But I'd also argue, for good reason, you're going to search better if you have some context, if you have some background knowledge, and your brain is always able to make some connections. You're going to ask better questions. But, you know, these ideas of collaboration, empathy, communication, you know, it's interesting. To some degree, they've always been incredibly, incredibly important. What I think is different now is, you know, we know we're in a world where AI is going to be able to do more and more and more. And the more folks who can really lean into the human element of being able to form connections, of being able to build trust, being able to win people over in authentic ways, I think they're going to naturally have an advantage. I also think, as I mentioned in the book, we're going to have to figure out ways to actually measure these things. You know, nowhere on my transcript from MIT is there any signal of my creativity, my communication skills. I mean, maybe you could read into it from some of my extracurriculars or things like that. But I think AI is actually going to allow us to open up the aperture of what students could do. You know, in the past, let's say, you know, you've done a lot of play-based learning type things. You know, you could get a psychologist in a room to evaluate a student, and they could probably learn a lot by observing, but that's a very expensive form of assessment. But now we can imagine a world in 5 years where you could have an AI ask a student, you know, with a bunch of Lego blocks on the table to make something interesting and to describe it and to now, you know, repurpose it and to, you know, analyze something else. And actually maybe give a reasonably, you know, I wouldn't want too much precision on the evaluation, but a reasonably large bucket, like, you know, this student does seem to be engaged, is curious, is able to do some of these tasks, which in the past and you can obviously extrapolate that to much more sophisticated tasks that we weren't able to really measure. And even simulations around empathy or communication or salesmanship or whatever you want to call it, I think we're going to be able to do not only practice, but maybe even some forms of assessment.
Sometimes as I see AI tools going into schools these days, I still see them being used in very narrow ways. And I agree with you that learning sort of some of the particular mathematic reading skills are important. But if the AI tools are only used to help you learn how to multiply fractions, it feels it's not taking advantage of things. I've always been a little frustrated that they sometimes will get used in that way without looking at the broader range of ways.
Yeah, and I think, you know, I try to be, all the time people pitch to us at Khan Academy, I'm sure you get these like, oh, you know, wouldn't it be great if we taught this or that? And they're usually really interesting things that the traditional system doesn't teach. But I normally say that's a great idea, but then I push back. I was like, well, if we just put this out there, it's just no one's going to use it unless the people who are already into it. So you're essentially going to be preaching to the choir. So I think the way that you really get some of these, let's call it broader set of skills formally into the system is to make the consumers of the system care about it. And so, for example, and this isn't AI, although AI might be part of it eventually. You know, we have a sister organization to Khan Academy called schoolhouse.world. And I think there's huge value of students tutoring other students. And I think many people would do that on their own just because they like it and they learn more, et cetera, et cetera. But when we went to universities and said, would you value this, including MIT, University of Chicago, Caltech, you know, some of the top, there's 40 of them. And they said, yeah, we actually would value it. And they put on their application. Now you get many more students getting a very clear signal that, hey, you shouldn't just learn the calculus. You should learn it and then teach it to other students around the world. Similarly, you know, this skill, we talk about empathy, communication. Obviously we have issues right now in our world of people being able to disagree in a productive way. Well, you know, we have a program on schoolhouse.world where we pair kids with kids of opposite points of view on really tough issues, on all the hot button issues, Israel, Palestine, affirmative action, gun control, free speech, you name it. And, you know, if we just put it out there, The kids who are already interested in it will engage, and I think there's many who are. But now, once again, universities like University of Chicago and others said, "Hey, we'll value this in the application." So when the consumers say, "Hey, this is a signal that we care about," then I think you'll get more people to engage. And I'm working on projects where employers will hopefully care about people who can teach other people. And teaching involves not just subject matter mastery; it involves communication, it involves empathy, oftentimes a lot of creativity. Same thing with being able to have a dialogue. In most workplaces, you aren't going to debate some of these hot button political issues, but these political issues are a good proxy for how do you have a constructive conversation with someone that you have a passionate disagreement about. And that does happen in the workplace all the time. And I think we all want people to have practice developing those skills and getting feedback on, you shouldn't dilute your point of view. But there's ways of communicating it better, and there's ways of listening better. And I think that's a very powerful skill. So that's what we're trying to do. Connect it to the pathways that people are really care about.
In some ways, I think my biggest concerns with AI, there's a lot written and you talk about in the book, and these are important concerns about, cheating and biases and errors. And those are important things to look at. I'm just as concerned it'll get put out there and it'll be used with standard pedagogies, and it'll just get used in the same way. So trying to show examples seems really important to me, both on how to use it in a collaborative way. And may I mention one other thing, that for me, having a more project-based approach is something that people learn so much from. A project-based where there's not a single answer, but they're learning to explore space and see what's possible. And the new AI could be supportive of that, but most people won't use it that way unless they see good examples.
Yeah, and I mean, there's so much in what you just mentioned. One is, if unless you bring it in broader ways than just helping you learn how to factor a polynomial. I mean, it can be useful for that too. But the real beauty of this latest generation of AIs is it allows you to do things that are conversational, as you mentioned, project-based, multimodal. You can create music and images and analyze. I mean, there's so much that you can do. It can look at even your mannerisms and your gestures and things like that. That, yes, it's a shame. And the problem is, if you don't bring it into the classroom, then there's kids in your or my family are still going to use it in these more broad ways. And these broad ways are going to be the things that really amplify their intent, really amplify their productivity, their creativity in the world, and they're going to be at a huge advantage. And obviously, we want to bring along as many people as possible to be able to leverage these tools. I mean, we're already seeing it when you just put the AI out there. There's a class of student who, they might use it every now and then to unblock them on a Khan Academy question or ask a few questions, but then they'll also, use it to go deep and be really curious about things. And those kids are going to be unstoppable. But we see a lot of other kids, I think there's almost been a learned helplessness that they've gotten a little bit because they're not used to being able to ask as many questions as they want. Every 4-year-old I know knows how to, they ask so many questions that it tires their parents and their teachers and everything. And then, unfortunately, I think when you go into a classroom that might have 20, 25, 30, 35 kids in it, it's very hard to address every child's curiosity, every child's interest. And, sometimes I think some kids get a learned helplessness. They say, well, maybe I shouldn't ask. I shouldn't keep saying why. I shouldn't. And then, they might fall a little bit behind, and then even their self-esteem gets hit, and then they stop asking questions. They'll say, this is a dumb question. I'd be embarrassed. And so I think a lot of it is also, how do we maybe leverage AI tools? So once again, it's not to teach kids to be curious. It's how do we avoid them from losing their curiosity in the first place?
Yeah, totally. Actually, one thing I wondered as I read the book, you oftentimes talk about the approach that you take with the AI tutor Conmigo is taking a Socratic approach, which, again, there are all sorts of advantages of that. But it emphasizes, oftentimes it's said with, and not just give them the answer. And I certainly agree, it's not a good pedagogical strategy to give them the answer. But somehow by always framing it in terms of a Socratic approach, it seems as though it's focusing on problems where there is an answer. And in fact, a lot of the other examples in the book and examples that I get excited about, whether it's, having a conversation with a historical figure or a figure from a book that you've read or other types of debates you have, don't have an answer. So it feels to me it could be important to start framing this where it's less about not giving the answer, but have some other ways of framing it, was something that came across to me as I read.
Yeah, and maybe the better framing is not giving the answer or a strong opinion, because
Yeah.
there's a lot of places where obviously we can have, we can imagine Socrates in ancient Athens. Most of their discussions were not ones that had a clear answer. They might have been philosophy or the role of a government in people's lives, where there could be a huge range of opinions. And one of the examples I think I gave in the book was a reporter who was very skeptical of Conmigo's ability to handle tough political issues. And, I said, well, you try it out. And the reporter I think this was the reporter's point of view, but they took on the persona of someone who's very pro gun control. And they go to Conmigo and they say, hey, it's crazy we have guns. The Second Amendment was made in a completely different time. Arms were muskets. They weren't AK-47s, et cetera, et cetera. And Conmigo didn't immediately jump in and say, oh, I agree with you or I disagree with you or anything. That Conmigo says, well, before we pass too much judgment, can you explain to me why the founders might have found it important to put the Second Amendment in? And then, the reporter said, well, yeah, in that context, we just, fought the Revolutionary War. The British didn't let us have a militia, and so we wanted to have one, and we didn't have a full-time standing army at the time. And Conmigo was like, good job, and then the reporter's like, yeah, but once again, that was a different time, but now it's completely different. And then the AI said, well, can you tell me, why do you think it's persisted? And it kept pushing, what are arguments that the other side would give? And this is clearly an area where there isn't probably a clear, objective right answer. There's a lot of nuance here, but it was pushing, in this case, the reporter, but the students thinking Socratically. So yes, I think Socratic, obviously it can work when there is a right answer, if it's factoring a polynomial question, but it can also really work well when there isn't a right answer. And look, that's where I see we're getting into the most trouble, where, and especially there are people who are sometimes worried about things like indoctrination in classrooms, et cetera. And sometimes those worries are overblown, but sometimes they're not. I've definitely seen it's very hard for sometimes educators, especially in the environment we're in today, to not sometimes color the conversation with their, and almost make it feel like there's a right or wrong answer on some of these areas where there is a lot more nuance.
Another point that you highlight as an important part of the AI tutor is the ability for personalization, and certainly as you're going through and a learner going through things, being able to give feedback and suggestions based on their own path and what their experience has been seems really important. It did strike me sometimes we talk about personalization in a slightly different way. That it's oftentimes about connecting to interest. We sort of put interest at the core. I think on both of these, the ultimate goal is engagement and motivation. But for me, one of the things that I'd really love to see more schools being able to do is be able to use this to let kids explore their own interests, which oftentimes doesn't happen in most school settings.
Oh, I agree. I mean, as you mentioned, personalization could be personalization of pacing. It could be personalization of depth. And it could also be personalization of interests or context, to your point. And, before generative AI, I actually, there was always this tension between, there are some very tangible skills you want the kids to develop. And if you want to really make sure they're mastering or having competency in those skills, you almost do have to do it in these sometimes in these, if you really want to make sure they're hitting all of the standards, because obviously people have done heroic efforts where they try to create projects that hit as many of these standards as possible. But projects by their very nature, people are going to come at it in different ways. And some kids might anchor on this standard more or that standard more. Some kids might find a new way of doing it that completely goes around all those standards, but it's still interesting for them. And so what I think very exciting about generative AI, and we can also think about applications in areas that kids care about, et cetera, is that it can do. I think we can have the best of both worlds now. I think in the things where we are a little bit more reductive, where we are saying, okay, I keep picking on factoring this polynomial, so I'll say, balance this chemical equation or whatever it might be. Yeah. We can now use it to maybe apply it in a broader set of areas, make it a little bit more project based. Teachers, it's very hard to, every night develop. I mean, there's people who've developed great lessons, but for everything to make it really relevant to the students, et cetera. But now generative AI, hey, make it about our local sports team, or hey, we're having an unusual hot spell in the city. Like, let's make it about that. It can do that in really powerful ways. And the other way around, if you start with the project, it can also say, well, what if we also make them do this, so that we can really make sure that they're nailing, this standard or that standard.
Yeah, this reminds me of one of my favorite examples from the Khan Academy videos. This is before the AI. I loved it when a couple of young people that were using our Scratch software, they're making an animated story that had a lot of different objects floating around and colliding with each other. And someone told them to really make this work well, they needed to learn some trigonometry. So they went to Khan Academy and they watched some Khan Academy videos about trigonometry, went back and applied it to their project, and were able to make a much better project as a result. For me, that really captured, you'd sometimes talk about on demand. So that was really on demand, was also deeply connected to their interest. And I have no doubt that because they learned the trig in a motivated way, they probably made deeper connections to the ideas. I know it's not easy doing that in a classroom of 30 people, and you don't know, but exactly when they're going to learn the different things. But I do think that I've always thought that even though that they're still using the Khan Academy videos and learning the trig step by step, if you can do it in a context where you really care about it, it'll make deeper connections to the ideas.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And as I said, it's both. Once again, and it depends on the project. If the project was just make a video game or something, then you may or may not need to do the trig. But if it's like, if you're a little bit more prescriptive, like you need to make the object be able to rotate and move in the directions, and then you pretty much have to learn the trig. And I agree, it's going to definitely motivate you much more. You're going to immediately see why sine, cosine, tangent, and converting between rectangular and polar coordinates are super important. But with that said, there's a practical consideration, and if we were emperors of the school system, we might be able to change it, but we're not. And so there are all these edge case conditions in trigonometry, trigonometric identities, et cetera, which will become useful later on, maybe, which you might not need for that application, but those might be useful things to learn. One, you might be assessed on those things, and then they might be valuable. They might be valuable to optimize your program. Maybe I'm making it too computationally intensive, and if I use this trig identity, I can do fewer computations. So yeah, that's where I think there's a balance. I think it's the ideal is you're able to kind of go back and forth between these worlds, because if you see every now and then, oh, that trig was useful, that linear algebra was useful, or that factoring was useful, I think it starts to go into your head that like, oh, this stuff can be useful. And so you might not need that evidence for every single skill taught, but you'll start to at least believe that, okay, this is going to show up later on in my life. It's not just a teacher telling me that.
One other thing with the new sort of AI assistants and agents that I've been trying to sort out in my head, I'd be interested to ask you about, is about the child's relationship with the technology. So like in the example I gave with the learning trig for the video game, there could be similar things with AI agents. If I have a question, it's great to have it as a resource and see this as an assistant that can help me out with the things that I'm working on. Just the same way I use other resources. I might ask a friend about it. I might do a Google search. I might, look at a YouTube video. There are lots of resources. This is a great resource. But another way that it's sometimes being used is that the agent is sort of becoming sort of a trusted friend and trying to, make me feel as though I'm being listened to and heard. And I sometimes worry if it's trying to take on a personified role and trying to become too human-like, then it might lead to an over-trusting. So you're trying to figure out the right way of positioning these, AI agents and for the child's relationship with the technology. What are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, we've been having these debates. One student wrote a comment. Conmigo's my new best friend, and you could view it as like, oh, the student just thought it useful. Conmigo's best friend because it always helps her academically, or you could interpret it as like maybe Conmigo's her new best friend. And so we had this debate, and my take on it is, if it's leading to constructive behavior and it's done in moderation, I think it can be a very good thing. And, constructive behavior, hey, if it's helping you academically, if it's helping you figure out, even social issues or ways of being that you're embarrassed to talk to your parents about. I'll give an example. I have 3 kids. They're 16, 14. My youngest one's about to turn 11. And my daughter, who's the middle one, her and my youngest, they're always arguing and this and that. And he always wants to be around her and she's always kind of too cool for him. And a couple of months ago, I saw her being kind of kind to him, including him. And I said, what happened? And she said, well, and I didn't even know this. She's like, I've been journaling with ChatGPT. Who knew? Maybe I'm not a bad dad for not even knowing this was happening in my house. But she's like, I asked ChatGPT, I was complaining to it about her brother. And it said, well, you're only going to live with him for a few years. And this dynamic is pretty common. Just remember, like, you're going to really reminisce about these days. And there's very few people in your life like your little brother. And you don't realize how much it means to, like, when you include him a little bit. And she said, yeah, I realized that I should. That was powerful. And, my wife or I could have given that exact same sermon to my daughter, and she would have just rolled her eyes. So I think that's powerful. Now, if it got to the point that my daughter is only confiding with the AI and is not, and is spending hours a day with it and is not forming real social connections or not spending time with my wife and I, and then that's a real issue. But I think that's true of anything. My sister growing up was a bookworm. Most of I haven't even heard people use that term lately, but like most parents would love if their kids want to read books a lot. But my sister, if you let her, would sit on the couch and read for like 16 hours a day. And that's when something goes beyond moderation. No, it's important for her to close the book and go talk to her friends and run outside, get some exercise, eat dinner. And so I think that's true of anything. So if it can be a positive, constructive influence, if it's motivating good behaviors, engagement in their academics, positive social behaviors, that's good. I mean, the same thing is about friends. You can have very positive, constructive friends in moderation. You can have very negative friends, or you can have positive friends, but if you're spending all your time with them, that can also become a negative thing.
I guess what I would like, though, is to put it in a separate category. It feels like, because clearly you can have good connections and collaborations with the AI agent, but they're different than the collaborations you do with friends. So I would like kids to grow up to see these as 2 separate things. The same way you have a great relationship with your pet dog, but it's different than your relationship with your brother or sister.
And I think it's a portfolio.
And sometimes they're getting merged together these days in ways.
And I do think, I 100% agree with you, and I think it's a portfolio, but I think even with human beings, like, some people think just chatting with your friends all night on a phone is a social connection. Well, it's a kind of one. But that has to be in a portfolio. Like, that has to be in moderation, but you still have to go to their house and you still have to hang out and you still have to have, awkward pauses in your conversation. So yes, I think it's all of the above. And look, I am curious and I am afraid that you are going to have people. In fact, I think it's already happening where they're having AI boyfriends and girlfriends and relationships. And, the movie Her, when I watched it, I thought, oh, there's no way. Her, people forget. I think it was made in 2014 or 2015. It takes place in 2025. And I remember when that came out, I was like, this is so unrealistic. AI is not going to be that good in 20, it might not be that good in another 100 years. Well, it turns out that they were pretty prescient. Now it turns out the most unrealistic part of that movie is that someone would have a career writing greeting cards. Like, that's great. AI does that. It's just great. But yeah, I think it's going to be fascinating to see, there's a loneliness epidemic, especially in Western civilization right now. And I think people are going to turn to these things. Now, in certain cases, it might ease some of the worst symptoms of loneliness, depression, and, and things like that. But should it be a substitute? I don't think it should. We have to, but if we aren't creating other structures, then maybe it's better than nothing.
I do think it's, for me, also the same way I appreciate with teachers. You're saying that these new AI agents are not going to be replacing teachers, and there's going to be a strong role for teachers. So for me, we shouldn't see these as the equivalent to teachers. It should be a different thing that can be very helpful in the learning process, but it's different than a human teacher. It's the same way that I think that for kids, that their friends are different than these AI agents. For teachers also, so it bothers me somewhat where it's sometimes in advertising, it says it's like another 20 teachers in the classroom. Well, not exactly. It is like another maybe teacher assistants in the classroom, but making sure that we see the human teachers as special. And I appreciate that you've also written about how human teachers do bring something special and are going to always have this special role.
I've always said, even before generative AI, because we've always been in this technology space, and there's always been a little bit of fear. Well, maybe videos will replace teachers, and I would say, like, that's ridiculous. If I had to pick between amazing teacher and amazing technology for my own children, I would pick amazing teacher every time. That's why I started a physical school. And if you visit Khan Lab School, you'll see more human-to-human interaction than I would say in any school. You'll see more conversation than you'll see in any school. You'll see the kids feeling more comfortable forming bonds and connections with the teachers and vice versa than I would think in any school. So I've always said, look, if I had to pick, definitely focus on the human. Ideally, you have the best of both worlds. And ideally, the technology should be used to liberate humans to have more human moments with each other. And we have been very careful because we believe this, that yes, Khanmigo can play the role, some aspects of a tutor, some aspects of a teaching assistant. But once again, it'll liberate the teachers and the students to have more human-to-human interactions with each other.
Well, maybe to wrap up, I'm going to pull another quote from your book where you say, at the very end of the book, you say, people have every right to be both scared and hopeful with what this leap in technology and innovation means. Each of us is an active participant in the decision about how we will use AI moving forward. Maybe if you just can share some words about where the best ways for people, I fully agree with you. I think they're both. I wrote something called Generative AI in Learning, Concerns, Opportunities, and Choices. And I do think the choices is really important, that there are concerns, there are opportunities, and there are choices people need to make. Can you talk a little bit about what are the ways people can make choices?
I talk a lot these days. Technology is fundamentally neutral. It just amplifies human intent. When we learn to harness fire, you can use it to destroy and burn. You could also use it to prepare food and keep warm. Same things with AI. It's not hard to imagine the bad use cases. The really bad use cases are going to be deep fakes and fraud and misinformation. I can even imagine totalitarian governments using it to, surveil people in really horrible ways. And then there's the maybe not purely evil, but still negative side effects. We can talk about the cheating problems. We can talk about, I am very, very worried about the economic dislocation that's about to happen or maybe already happening from this. I think this is actually probably the biggest, if I had to say the single biggest problem of the next 50 years, it's going to be this. You're going to have major shifts in, just as we get wealthier and more productive because of AI, you're going to have major dislocation in the job market. I'm not one of these people that think it'll all just sort itself out. We have to be proactive about it. But but if we just say, oh, this is horrible and run away from it, you're ceding this technology to all of these bad outcomes. So you're pretty much going to ensure a dystopian scenario. So all of us should be leaning in. And, when you really start to, and play, Mitch, you've done so much work in play. All of us as adults should get these tools and start playing with them. And if you start doing that now, you are going to discover things that it could be useful in your life. And every time you have a task you need to do, say, hey, maybe I could use this. Maybe I could use AI a little bit to tighten up this paper. Or maybe I could, say, hey, it's my mother's birthday. Maybe I'll get AI to write a song for her. Or maybe I can make a fun video to post on social media to get my point across. And the more you play with it, or hey, maybe I can vibe code a prototype instead of going and asking someone to do it, or instead of hiring a firm to do it. So there's so much here. And if people, hey, maybe I can write a story with my child in an AI and pique their curiosity. So there's so much. I mean, we could go on for hours and hours and hours. But those are the types of things that if we lean into amplifying our positive intent, and look, maybe I need to learn. Maybe I can come up with AI techniques to prevent cheating, AI techniques to counteract the job dislocation and reskill people, and AI to maybe figure out to counteract deep fakes and validate information. Then we're going to have a good world. I believe most people are good, and so if they amplify their intent with this technology, we're going to have more of a utopia than a dystopia.
It was great talking with you, Sal. Thanks a lot for talking, and look forward to continuing to see the things coming out of your work.
Great. Thanks, Mitch. See you later.
The Lifelong Kindergarten podcast is produced by Mitch Resnick and Eric Schelling in the Lifelong Kindergarten Research Group at the MIT Media Lab. You can find other episodes, additional resources, and online conversation in our Substack at bit.ly/LLK podcast.